Okay, I am standing here at the Alexander Currans farm. This house was built in 1799. It was began in 1798 when the foundation and the beginning stones were laid. So at the time this house was being built, the first president of the United States, George Washington, was still alive. It is located on the southern end of the battlefield, about a half of a mile from Warfield Ridge, which is the ridge in the distance there to the north here on the Emmitsburg Road. The house sits at the address 1775 Emmitsburg Road. Now, this home was in the crossfire of Union and Confederate troops on July 2nd and July 3rd of 1863. Now, let's take a look at the house on July 2nd. On July 2nd, 1863, Hood's Corps of Texas troops formed at this house before their assault on Devil's Den and Little Round Top. So those Texans troops formed right here at the Alexander Currans house and then moved in that direction where you see the woods there. And if you pass through that woods, you will come to the First Texas Monument. And then, of course, beyond that would be the Bushman Farm, and then, of course, Devil's Den, Triangular Field, and Little Round Top directly in that direction. So Hood's troops on the afternoon of the 2nd formed here at the Alexander Currans farm. Now on July 3rd of 1863, this farm took on even a more prominent role when it was used as an attack for Merritt's U.S. regular cavalry. Merritt's regulars approached the house from the south down the Emmitsburg Road, headed toward our camera around 11 a.m. Now, this brigade was 8 companies of the 6th Pennsylvania, otherwise known as Rush's Lancers. They were thrown forward as skirmishers, coming toward the direction of our camera, toward the advance of the Confederate troops, which were here just beyond this house about where we stand now. Now, Colonel John L. Black, who was in command of the 1st South Carolina Cavalry, was amongst the first to see the advancing Union cavalry, and he was just in the distance over here to the west of the house. Black sees these advancing Federal cavalry, and he reports that to Brigadier General Evander Law, and then he ordered his men forward into a line of battle. Now, for the right of the Confederate line, actually, the right of the entire Confederate line was being held by infantry under Brigadier General George Anderson's brigade. And that brigade consisted of the 7th, 8th, 9th, 11th, and 59th Georgia. All of those but the 7th were engaged on July 2nd. Now, the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry drove blacks beyond the Alexander Currans house to the north, which we see here in front of us. Now, at the time, the 7th Georgia would have been here, the 8th Georgia next to them, the 11th Georgia, and then, of course, the 59th Georgia later would be wheeled in. Now, the Currans house was filled with Confederate sharpshooters as the Federal assault continued northward up the Emmitsburg Road. They began to take cover when the advancing Federal cavalry came in. Now, back in the distant south, Captain William Graham's battery arrived and took a position on a hill which sits behind this modern building today. He took a position on the right side of the Emmitsburg Road and drove, along with the 6th Pennsylvania, the sharpshooters from the Alexander Currans farm. And of course, the house was taken by Federal forces. Confederate infantry later would rally, but for one small moment, the entire right flank of General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army had been compromised. And this is all happening just as Pickett's charge is being repulsed. So it's actually an action that's taken place after Pickett's charge, where now the Confederate right is being flanked by Union cavalry under Wesley Merritt. And of course, at the same time, General Elon Farnsworth is having his charge in the distance there, just beyond the trees over by Bushman's Hill and Big Round Top. This would be a flanking maneuver that gets very little talk and discussion. Now, one of the reasons that happens is because of the romantic idea of Gettysburg, that the Battle of Gettysburg ended with Pickett's charge and the Confederate soldiers retreating back from whence they came across the field. It's a very popular, it's a very romantic story, but there were actually actions that were going on after that action, and this action here at the Currans farm is one of those. Of course, with Confederate support and no Union support, the Currans property would later be the right flank of the Confederate Army would reorganize, and they would take back the area, and the Federal assault would end. Now, this farm is beautifully restored, and it's actually one of the only farms here in Gettysburg that even has a real gas lamp still operating in it, which I thought was very interesting while walking over on the property here. There is a story, whether it's fact or fiction is really not a lot of proof behind it, but apparently during the Union and Confederate sharpshooters in this farm being driven out, artillery firing into this, apparently at one time the house had caught fire, and part of it, or portion of it, was destroyed and of course later rebuilt. This is the Alexander Currans farm here just south of Warfield Ridge on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.